Okay, so can you tell us, what do we mean by restorative practice as a way of being in schools?
Thanks, Leah. Yeah, restorative practice is more than just a thing we do. It's a way of being in the whole school. It's how we are every day, how we show up every day. People often think of restorative practice they think of circles, but actually it's a way of being that promotes connection and belonging in the whole school community, or whichever community you are in. It's based firmly in shared values that are established together in the group, and it uses a restorative language, which is a language that doesn't cause harm. It seeks not to cause harm. Often this is referred to as non-violent communication. So when this is your way of being and harm occurs, as it always does between people, it gives us the means to repair the harm and to restore the connection and belonging that we all need so fundamentally. What I really like about it as a practice is that it gives you the ability to mess up and to make a mistake and not be excluded from your community. Quite often, behaviour systems, particularly in schools, or also judicial systems, but behaviour systems are set up with a series of unattainable ideals that none of us can meet all of the time. And then when we don't, we're punished, it's very harmful to us all. It promotes a lot of fear. But with restorative practice, we're allowed to make a mistake, and we're allowed to talk about it and re-enter the community and repair that. That's what I really like about it.
And you know what, that brings up for me the importance of building relationships and the value we place on those members of the community within the relationships. People's feelings are valued is an absolute essential for restorative practice, building that positive relationship and promoting a sense of community within the school. That was something that I must say personally, I appreciated when we started this writing process, that you, Emer, you introduced us to be intentional about how we entered the process. And we did that conversation circle. For me personally, what that did, it built trust among us. It made me feel far more comfortable and relaxed. I was able to participate. It totally felt non-judgmental. And then the idea of being vulnerable came up. It came up in such an amazing way. And I said to myself, we are modeling this practice. Imagine if we as educators get in the classroom, do that modeling, because of course we talk about teaching our students the desired behavior. So for me, the building of relationship and how we model that among ourselves have been absolutely valuable. Yeah.
And just to build on that briefly, I think as a group, we've been so intentional about acting restoratively. There's been a lesson in kind of demonstrating a similar intentionality to the children that we work with, how that they know they're intentionally part of a restorative approach within their school communities as well.
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's the way you are, but then it changes what you do in very small ways, but they're quite important.
So then, what does restorative practice look like in practice, and what are the benefits for the whole learning community?
So practicing restoratively, really it occurs in a relational sense between all the different members of the school community. Really, it kind of reflects the messiness and the variability of human relationships in real life. It avoids hierarchy, it avoids judgment, it avoids violent communication. If you think traditionally, as Emer was just saying there, schools often took very punitive behaviourist approaches to maintaining order and discipline in some kind of way. And as we were mentioning, the language of justice, I guess, sort of prevailed there. So words like rules, consequences, blame, guilt, victim, perpetrator.
Yeah.
And you can see really the negative connotations with an approach like that. For example, if there was conflict or an altercation between two children in a school, usually it will be resolved whereby the teacher might mediate in some kind of way by administering some form of consequence or punishment for a behaviour that they deemed to be inappropriate or undesirable. But really there was little emphasis on the actual relationship between the children involved in the original conflict or altercation. Within a restorative approach, by contrast, the focus obviously is on rebuilding, repairing, mending the damage that has occurred to that relationship in the first place. And we've sort of developed the analogy of a whirlwind to demonstrate that, because I guess, first of all, it reflects the multi-directional nature in which all of these interactions are occurring. But as well as that, it shows the tensions and the conflict and the challenges that are associated with it. We also spoke a lot about how within a restorative approach, you can understand these conflicts or breakdowns of relationships to be intentional, but also unintentional. And instead of kind of focusing on blame or the individual's behavior, it's about sort of understanding the needs or the feelings or the emotions that they're communicating in a given moment and resolving them from there. As Emer was saying, a really important element of restorative practice in practice is the restorative circles. And they essentially enable individuals within the school community or the learning community to build that sense of community, that sense of belonging by sharing information about themselves. So one example of that might be demonstrating their energy levels or sharing something about like a personal interest or a personal preference to build that sense of community, understanding, belonging with each other. And importantly, I suppose to note with that kind of restorative circle practice and the use of restorative language, it reduces the likelihood of conflict, of damage to relationships occurring because of the sort of atmosphere and culture it cultivates in the first place. However, inevitably, like all human relationships, conflict will occur, breakdown in relationships will occur. And when that happens, we have our restorative conversations or our restorative meetings, depending on the severity of the situation or the incident that happened, which serve, I guess, to scaffold the resolution or repair to the damage that's happened to the relationship. There are 6 key questions associated with this. And essentially, as I said, they can scaffold that repair process. It might be useful to print these at different places around your school, or as Emer is about to demonstrate with a handy little card, you can just have them somewhere on a lanyard or on your pocket to scaffold these interactions with children. So Emer, I'm going to let you take it from there.
Sure. Thanks, John. So you start with the first 5 questions, and then when all the parties have an answer to all the first 5 questions together as a group, you discuss the final one. So the questions are, what happened? What were you thinking of at the time? What have you thought about it since? Who has been affected and in what way? How could things have been done differently? And finally, what do you think needs to happen next?
And it scaffolds that repair that's occurred between the different members of the school community. And that could be anyone in the school community, of course, couldn't it? I suppose when we talk about benefits, as well as building this sense of community, this sense of belonging, which lessens the likelihood of conflicts like this occurring, a key benefit is the sense of accountability that it cultivates and establishes within all members of the learning community. Accountability for their behaviour, accountability for their role in conflicts that might occur, and also accountability for their role and responsibility in re-establishing and repairing and mending that relationship or the damage that's been done in whatever way. As a final important point to note, I guess, and this is something we've discussed a lot, it can't be something that happens with one teacher in one classroom with one group of children. It requires a whole school approach. It requires buy-in from all members of the school community. It can't be done tokenistically. It requires intentionality if you're to see the most effective and truest effects of the process.
Yeah, but you know what, when I think of the conversation, I think of the benefits, and you mentioned it a number of times, and it's the benefit and the power of belonging. You think about a circle, you think about a membership, you think about a community. And so for me, in order for us to use reflective practice as a way of being, our students must feel a genuine sense of belonging. Imagine coming into a room, in a classroom, in a space, anywhere, and being a part of a circle, but not feeling like you belong to that circle. How is trust going to be built? And so for me, in order for us to build that positive environment, we must have a sense of belonging. And Carlton Biggs talks about belonging means being invited. It means being welcome, being seen. We talk a lot about that in our conversation about being seen and the positive ideas about being seen. And so, you know, I think about one of the a quote that I love from Allen 2022 that talks about belonging is the extent to which children feel individually welcome, respected, included, and supported by others in that school environment. And so I keep going back, you know, I use that physical, the circle. Imagine again being into that space, but not feeling like you belong. And so for me, one of the benefits of that space is actually creating and building those relationships and that community, a strong sense of belonging. And so, yeah, it's important. Thank you for that. Thank you for that.
when we talk about the circles as well, and this is something you touched on, Emer, that sitting in line, sitting sort of parallel to each other isn't a natural way to be in a group. Like throughout history, throughout ancient times, people came together in circles, convened in circles. So it's so natural in building that sense of community and belonging, which is so important.
Yeah.
Okay, so who are you and how do you understand yourself as a restorative teacher?
That's a powerful question. Who am I? I notice in other groups, I must mention that I've seen that very question. And it's important. Oftentimes, as educators, as educational leaders, when we're doing the work of equity, inclusion, diversity, social justice, belonging, whatever you want to call it, anti-oppressive practices, we run quickly to policies and processes and documentation. We need that form of a guide. What I personally feel is lacking is that intentional reflection is asking yourself, who am I? What are the lens I'm coming to the conversation with? The identity I'm coming to the conversation with, my vantage point, my values, my biases. I think these are things we have to be honest and authentic about. Because if not, all of this inclusive work, anti-oppressive work, equity work becomes very performative if we lack that authentic reflection. And so for me, the who am I is absolutely important when we are self-checking. We're so used to the term member check-in. But what about self-checking? And so I believe that when you can answer those questions honestly, then you can be a more valuable member of that community, of that circle, of that conversation, because you have done the work in understanding who you are and how you are will impact how you lead. So
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I love that. I'm wondering though, what does that look like in an inclusive restorative practice?
It is about, for me, it's about who you are then will create safer spaces. But I want us to underline the fact that in order for us to create safer spaces, we have to create braver spaces. And those are the spaces that allow students to come as they are in those circles. Because a lot of times I think in some of these practices, we have to feel like we need to be somebody else to be a part. You know, I can personally share my own lived experience, you know, growing up in Jamaica, traveling, living in the Bahamas and moving to Canada. How often you feel like you need to show up as somebody else. And it's a popular saying that many of us said, we don't get to show up as our whole self. And I'm sorry, but I have to go back to when we started this process, and I said to you how it impacted me. I have had the opportunity to show up as my authentic self among us as writers. Imagine in an inclusive environment if our students get the opportunity to show up as themselves. And when you do that, you disrupt the inequities, you disrupt those exclusionary spaces, because you say to our students, come as you are, come in the circle as you are. We will work together to build who you are. So for me, the impact of inclusion, the impact of equity is that we get to disrupt those inequities. We get to disrupt those oppressive spaces. We get to disrupt students needing to be somebody else than their authentic self. And restorative practice really fosters that kind of inclusionary work that we so desire. Yeah.
Thanks, Andrew.
And I think as well, when you talk about who you are as a teacher when you're leading restorative practice, you have to be aware that oftentimes as teachers, we've all come through this traditional, maybe punitive, discipline-oriented system. And oftentimes teachers have succeeded and done well within that system.
Yes.
And when you talk about acknowledging your own biases and assumptions and preferences, we need to call ourselves out and see ourselves as teachers in the experiences that we've had moving forward into this newer approach.
I have to jump in there. You said something so powerful. You said we have to call ourselves out. In inclusive practice, inclusive work, there's a big conversation about calling out, calling in. We are intentional about moving away from calling out to call in. But imagine if we each take the responsibility the accountability, and teach that to our students as well, to call yourself out. So nobody needs to call you out. You just said it, the magic in calling yourself out, the magic in saying, should I have said that? Was that nice? Was that kind? You're doing that self-checking, that calling out. So when you go into the circle, when you go into the conversation, you have already done a deep work on self, and you allow that process to be way more effective because you have done that deep work. So I really, really had to underline that. Thank you. Thank you for that, Chris.
And just to add to that, we're getting carried away, but I love what you said is that what you're doing is not modeling in a kind of traditional way, but it is your way of being. I keep on coming back to this, and then the people around you see it, and then that work starts to happen for them, in themselves. So we all begin to kind of navigate the world slightly differently. I feel like I've just taken a slight step, about 40 degrees, maybe not even that much, but it changes everything.
Yeah. And actually, Hannah now has some examples of where maybe a restorative approach has worked really well, but also in some areas where it's worked less well. So Hannah might like to share those examples now.
Yeah, so I suppose I've seen how it works not at all from a parent point of view, and I've seen how it works well from my own work practice in previous jobs. So where it doesn't work well is where it's supposed to be used as a reflective process for the young person in a school setting, but where a teacher isn't really involved, and it's just used as a way to say, well, we went through this process and therefore we can tick that off. So from my own personal point of view, I have a child who started secondary school. He has ADHD, which I suppose is important because the things that he gets into trouble for, from my point of view, he shouldn't really be getting into trouble for anyway. So talking out of turn, distracting people, it's all classic ADHD. And at the end of each of these, when he gets into trouble, he will bring home a sheet of paper and it will have a list of questions. What happened? How did you feel when it happened? What was the consequence of it happening, and what should you do next time is generally the list of questions. Sometimes the teacher will have filled in what he did, and sometimes it's left for him to fill in. So if a teacher hasn't spoken to him, he will often not even know what he did, and he's supposed to bring this home and fill it out. So first of all, a teacher is not getting involved at all. It's just given to him, and he might be told, you talked out of turn, now take that away and fill that in. So what I see is that it's always the same thing. What happened? I was talking. How did you feel? Silly, or I don't know. How did it affect others? I don't know. Or maybe it stopped other people from working. And what can you do next time? Not talk. So what has he learned from that? He's learned absolutely nothing. I'm annoyed as a parent because I know that he hasn't learned anything. And when I have to sign it and send it back in, they're supposed to look at it. And surely they can tell he has learned nothing from it. And yet it's the same system going over and over again. So what I see is there's zero curiosity from the teacher, when it could be a really powerful way to understand what his needs are in that moment. Why was he talking? What happened to you at that moment? Why were you talking? Were you bored? Did you need the toilet? Did you want to ask a question, but you were too embarrassed to ask a question? There's loads of opportunities to learn something that will help it not happen again, but it's not being done. So the cycle repeats itself. So that's where it absolutely does not work.
Yeah, it sounds like that's the use of the questions as a tick box exercise without the teacher really engaging in the values-based piece around building relationships and genuinely a restorative way of being, as Emer explained to us earlier.
Yeah, and this is a secondary school, so it's a variety of teachers. So I wonder, at the root of it, is it that the teachers have not been taught how to use it properly? Or is it just that nobody has an interest in using it and we can say that we've done it, but nobody is really interested in actually doing it?
And you also have an example, Hannah, of a situation where restorative practice was used in the way it really is envisaged, as a way of being rather than that tick box approach. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so in a previous role, I would have worked in a rehabilitation learning centre. So a lot of high-risk young people A lot of them are on probation. So I suppose at the foundation, you have a lot of young people in a small space who can be quite explosive or chaotic anyway. So the entire system in that centre is based on restorative practice. That number one, at the foundation of that, the behaviour is separate from the person. So even when a situation happens, we are removing the person and the behaviour. So there is never any shame or embarrassment that a situation happened. It's completely separate. So in order to be able to effectively use restorative practice, nobody should feel a sense of shame in that moment anyway, right? Otherwise, they're never going to be able to learn because they'll be defensive. And as an educator, you also have to come from a place of curiosity that even if you were in the room when the incident happened, you have to remove any assumption that you know exactly what happened and how it started, and remove judgment from whose fault it was in that moment. So when you're coming together, whether it's you and the young person or maybe 2 or 3 young people and yourself, it's a blank slate. So this is the incident that happened. We know that it happened. Now, can everybody talk about what happened from their point of view? So you're getting everybody's idea of what happened in that moment. And then we can talk about, well, what was the consequence of that incident happening and how did it affect not only yourselves, but me as an educator and any other young people in the room. So if it was a situation where the space was made unsafe, we may have removed everybody from that room, let the young person calm down, because if they are up here, they're not going to be able to talk about anything anyway. So you let them calm down, and then we're going to talk about that incident. What triggered that? How are you feeling in the moment? How did it affect others around you? Well, everybody had to be removed and we couldn't continue. And maybe I smashed some chairs, so actually there's damage and that affects further learning process. So they know that there's going to be a consequence, but they also help make that consequence, if you know what I mean. So it's not a punishment, but it's like this happened and there are consequences to behavior. So we have to decide what is a good level of what's another word for punishment that isn't punishment?
Reparations,
yeah,
maybe.
Yeah. So how do we, how do we repair this? And that might be that you need to take a day off because you need to calm down and everybody else needs to lower, or maybe it's that you need to have a conversation with the people that it happened to. But at the end of it, they are able to have a self-awareness of what triggered them. So how can we effectively move on from this? If that's a trigger for you, can you remove yourself from that situation if you feel that coming up? Or can you ask for people can everybody stop being loud, or can everybody stop saying those things because it's making me uncomfortable? Being able to use other forms of communication rather than exploding or having it be anger, whatever caused it. So it might not happen immediately, it usually doesn't, it usually happens over a period of time, but it does bring self-awareness, which is what you want to happen. And at the end of it, that young person is never going to feel, oh, I'm so embarrassed about going back into the classroom, I can't see those people again because I made a fool of myself, or, they're going to think that I'm a terrible person, because it's never about the person, it's always about the behavior. So I think curiosity is key from the point of the view of the educator or the person who's doing the restorative practice, but also making sure that everybody involved in that process is given the space to bring about their own self-awareness, because they have to learn from themselves ultimately.
That's great, Anna. Thank you.
Thanks.
Could you tell us now, though, what are the common critiques of restorative practice and what are the common myths associated with it?
Thanks, Leah. I'm really glad you've asked that question. I think one of the most common critiques that you hear is that people are going to be let off the hook and there will be no accountability. And actually, I have found in practice that it's the opposite, because by fostering an environment where there are shared values, where the language is used that is restorative, it opens up the space for us to be able to listen and really hear each other and recognise and acknowledge the harm we have caused, and then seek to repair it. And when that seeking comes from the person who caused the harm, and we're all capable of causing the harm. So a person isn't being isolated as the person who caused harm. We're all capable of that behaviour. But when you can honestly sit in a space with people and know you won't be judged while this is being discussed, your barriers come down, the fences come down, and you're able to call yourself to account. And that's the whole point about restorative practice, is that you're given the space to call yourself to account to yourself, but also within your community. And that is really powerful. And quite often, like in practice in schools, we end up having to row the children back because the repair they want to make is far in excess of what they've done. So we find that we're in totally different, it's not a lack of accountability, it's like, okay, great that you're accountable, but it wasn't that bad. Playing together tomorrow would probably be enough. Letting the person join your game would probably be enough. So that's the accountability thing, but it's really important because the aim is always to meaningfully re-establish connection and belonging. And that's what this form of accountability does. And then another myth, I suppose, is that circles are just sort of some airy-fairy kind of children sitting in a circle, reading a story without any intention. I mean, I love reading stories in a circle. But the circles, the way they're used in restorative practice, they're used intentionally and purposefully. And this is where the facilitator comes in. It's really important that the facilitator creates a circle with intention, with purpose, and invites people to be there. You alluded to this earlier, Andrew, that, well, it's the calling in, but it's also the willing participants. Maybe it was you, Sean, who said it, that if we cannot force people to be in a circle, but when you have willing participation, they then create the space where we can practice the values and the language of shared community. So then, when things fall apart, we're ready, we're able, we don't fall apart, we can hold it. So, yeah.
Another myth is that it takes away from instructional time, right? We have to do another thing that takes away from instructional time. And what is more important? For me, I always ask, what is more important and powerful in education than creating and cultivating, and of course, and sustaining a respectful classroom climate and culture that will serve as a foundation for teaching and learning? Just go to that classroom where you see students are respectful, where the environment is more, there's a culture and a climate that says of respect. You can guarantee that learning is going to take place. You can guarantee, because there are certain fundamental skills when it comes to, and the reality is that the time it takes from us to keep on administering discipline, we have now spent a different amount of time to now establish a community versus always approaching and attending to a disciplinary matter. So the time is needed. It will take some time. Let's be honest about that. It will take some time, but that is invested time. That time, I consider time invested time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think on that invested time point, it's really important to acknowledge that it won't work overnight. It won't happen straight away. It does take time because you're challenging these traditional approaches that have been in place for so long. But as you said, it is that investment and it is worth it once it's established and the culture is developed. Yeah.
Okay, so you've already touched on this a little bit, but let's tease it out a little bit further. How can restorative practice foster inclusion and challenge inequality?
For me, that big word is belonging, right? Who determines who belong? What does belonging look like? What does belonging look like in restorative practice? What does belonging look like in the classroom? What does belonging look like in the school and the wider community? Students understand at an early age when someone or something doesn't belong. And many educational leaders, many classroom teachers keep pretending that the student don't see the messages. So we have to be very clear in our restorative practice space. We have to be very clear in our classroom, in our school community, in the extended school community about what belonging looks like. The reality is that students see and they understand that belonging means I am loved, I'm cared for, I am seen. Okay? So that is why educational leaders, classroom teachers must create a school culture and climate. I'm going back to that again, create the school culture and climate, and sustain that same culture and climate of belonging, because it's critical for students to be able to engage.
Yeah, totally. And when you talk about that point on belonging, I think we need to acknowledge how diverse the children within our classrooms are, and of course in society more broadly as well. Think about people from different backgrounds, different ethnic and racial backgrounds, different genders, sexualities, social class backgrounds, disabilities, whatever it might be, additional needs, and that we have this whole range of different students with different sort of dispositions in our classrooms, and within that diversity, creating a sense of belonging is so important, isn't it? Because that when you're in this classroom, no matter who you are and what you bring, you're part of this group, you're part of this community, and you belong here and you're important here. And you spoke before about that integral role that you play within the group, and that within this community, within this classroom community, everyone is integral and everyone belongs, which is important.
Absolutely.
Thanks, John. That made me think there, though, about the diversity within ourselves. So I often feel this, that I'm never just one thing or one person. We've all got lots of different identities, and we all show up differently depending on our needs and our wants and what's been met and what's happened that morning. And I feel that too often, particularly in schools, but also in the wider society, we talk about separating the behaviour from the person. I understand why, but the behaviour is an expression of our needs. And so I'll be accountable for my behaviour, but please don't shame me for it. Yeah. So that's what I think is really important, that we sometimes the separation is a good thing, but I still did it. And I think you're left with this little bit of everybody saying that was a bad behaviour, it wasn't me, but I did it. And the reason I did it, and then I can talk about my needs and my feelings. But I think it's really important that we kind of speak holistically to the many people who are inside us all,
Yes.
That's great. Okay, so finally, in summary, what are the key ingredients of restorative practice?
Yeah, so in summary, obviously we've touched on a lot here, and I think it's just so important to acknowledge that a restorative approach isn't like some optional menu where you can pick and choose different things and call yourself restorative. It's a philosophy, it's a culture that's embedded throughout the school community, throughout all members of the learning community. As Emer said, it's not something that you do, it's something who you are as a school, as an individual, as a member within that school community. An integral ingredient of that, of course, is the circles. And the circles serve to build that sense of community, build that sense of belonging, sharing things about each other on a consistent basis. And through that, learning and developing and embedding the language, or the restorative language that we've come to familiarize ourselves with within this approach as well. Obviously, as we spoke about earlier, sometimes breakdowns will happen within these relationships and within these different dynamics. And when that does happen, as we said, depending on the extent or the severity of the situation, you can have your restorative conversations, your restorative meetings with these questions to scaffold the repair and restoration of the harm that has occurred. And they really are essential components within that. Another really important key ingredient to acknowledge is the fact that this can't happen on an individual level within one classroom or with one teacher. It requires that whole school level where everyone is really intentional about what they're doing and informed by this overall philosophy that informs the culture of the school. It's not tokenistic, it's intentional, as I said. And really, it just provides such an opportunity to shift how we approach what we do in schools, this relational approach, and such an amazing opportunity for how schools and society function more broadly.
Thanks a lot, John. I just would like to add, when we talk about a whole school environment, and obviously that's the optimal, but it's not always possible. And being restorative, it has value even if it's just you doing it. Because by establishing shared values with your group and using language that doesn't cause harm, well, you're not causing harm.
Yeah.
And that has to be a good thing.
Yeah.
But also, within the school community, what we're doing is children are looking at us and they're taking that with them into their communities, into the wider world, and into their lives. So even though I completely agree the whole school approach is optimal, don't shy away if you're the only person doing it, using that language.
Yeah, even the smallest amount is worthwhile. Yeah.